Over 3,400 years ago, a child was born under Pharaoh Ahmose I, brutal decree against Israelite sons. Hidden in secrecy, Moses was later raised in Egypt's royal court, trained in wisdom and warfare. Under Thutmose II, he became a general, leading Egypt's army against the Nubians. After Thutmose II's death, Hatshepsut and Thutmose III's ruled, and Moses' position became uncertain. Forced to flee Egypt, he left behind power and privilege for the wilderness, unaware that his journey was part of a divine plan. His exile was not the end, it was only the beginning. Are you ready to uncover the story of Moses, the man chosen to deliver a nation? The migration of the Israelites. The Israelites, originally settled in Goshen near Bubastis, experienced rapid population growth starting in 1651 BC. As their numbers increased, many began migrating toward Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos, who ruled northern Egypt at the time. The Hyksos, being Semitic like the Israelites, welcomed them, and the two groups coexisted peacefully. This period allowed the Israelites to thrive, free from oppression, engaging in trade, herding, and skilled labor. It was during this time that the lineage of Amram and Jochebed moved to Avaris. The rise of the 18th dynasty. In 1539 BC, Prince Ahmose I, Egyptian ruler of the Theban dynasty, ascended the throne after the death of his brother, Kamose, who had nearly expelled the Hyksos from the delta. However, there was a challenge. Ahmose was only 10 years old. With his kingdom trapped between the Hyksos in the north and the Nubians in the south, survival depended on careful planning. For the next 10 years, in secrecy, they prepared for war to reclaim the land lost 108 years ago. Now, in 1529 BC, the time has come. Egypt is ready to rise again. The end of the Hyksos rule. Ahmose I launched his campaign against the Hyksos by attacking Heliopolis around 1529 BC, securing a key strategic position. He then marched on Avaris, the Hyksos capital, and laid siege to the city for nearly 3 years before it finally surrendered around 1526 BC. However, the remaining Hyksos fled to Saruhen in southern Canaan, where Ahmose pursued them. Determined to end their rule completely, he besieged Saruhen for 3 years until its final defeat around 1523 BC. This marked the end of Hyksos rule in Egypt, which had lasted 108 years, and solidified Ahmose's control, ushering in the 18th dynasty in Egypt's rise as a powerful, unified kingdom once again. The Israelites being oppressed. Ahmose I, the new pharaoh of Egypt, assessed the delta situation while as the Hyksos left in 1526 BC and saw a growing threat. The Israelites, once a protected people in Egypt, had multiplied into a vast population. With the Hyksos expelled and their former Egyptian soldiers who worked from them now disarmed, Ahmose appointed them as taskmasters over the Israelites, forcing them into hard labor to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses. When this did not slow their growth, he increased their workload, subjecting them to relentless oppression. Still, their numbers continued to rise. In response, he commanded the Hebrew midwives to kill all newborn Israelite boys at birth, but they defied him, allowing the infants to live. Enraged, in 1520 BC, Ahmose issued an even harsher decree: every Hebrew baby boy was to be thrown into the Nile. This final act of cruelty marked the time when the future Moses was born, a child who would one day lead his people to freedom. The birth of Moses. In May 1519 BC, Moses was born to Amram and Jochebed, an older Israelite couple. At this time, Pharaoh Ahmose I had decreed the death of all newborn Hebrew boys. Despite the risk of execution, they hid their son for 3 months, hoping to keep him safe. When hiding him became impossible, they made a difficult choice. Jochebed wove a basket from reeds, waterproofing it with tar, and placed Moses in the Nile, entrusting his life to God's protection. This act of faith set in motion events that would change history. Pharaoh's daughter. Jochebed carefully placed baby Moses in a reed basket, sealing it with tar to keep it afloat. She chose a quiet spot south of the temple area, where Mutnofret, daughter of Ahmose I, was enjoying an afternoon outing. The Nile was at a low level, as it was not inundation season, ensuring a gentle current that would prevent the basket from drifting too far. Miriam, Moses' sister, followed closely along the riverbank, watching as the princess noticed the floating basket. Intrigued, Mutnofret called her servants to fetch it, and when she opened it, she saw the crying infant. Moved with compassion, she realized it was a Hebrew baby. At that moment, Miriam stepped forward and offered to find a Hebrew nurse, leading to Jochebed being chosen to raise her own son under Egyptian protection. The adoption of Moses. When Moses turned 2, as was customary in Israelite tradition, he was weaned and prepared to leave his family. Officials from Thebes arrived to take him to the royal court in Thebes, where he would be raised under the care of Mutnofret and her husband, a powerful military official who would later become Pharaoh Thutmose I. As Amram and Jochebed watched their son being carried onto the boat, they knew they might never see him again. The journey to Thebes, over 600 kilometers to the south, would take days along the Nile. Yet, as the vessel drifted away, they held on to faith, believing that God had a greater purpose for Moses, even as he left behind his people and birthplace. Legacy of Ahmose I. When Ahmose I died in 1514 BC, he left behind a kingdom strengthened by his military victories and grand building projects, including his own pyramid and other monuments. His legacy would be carried on by those closest to him. His 10-year-old son, Amenhotep I, ascended the throne, a young ruler inheriting the weight of Egypt's future. Among those in the royal court was Moses, just 5 years old, growing up under the watchful eyes of the palace. His queen, Nefertari, mourned the loss of her husband. The royal household also included Princess Ahmose and Mutnofret, the wives of Thutmose I, the future king, who would play a role in shaping the next generation of rulers. As Egypt moved forward under a new king, the foundation laid by Ahmose I ensured that his dynasty would continue to shape history. Long reign of Amenhotep I. Amenhotep I ascended the throne of Egypt at the young age of 10 following the death of his father, Ahmose I. As a child ruler, his mother, Ahmose Nefertari, played a crucial role in guiding his early reign, serving as both regent and a powerful figure in her own right. Amenhotep I was the only surviving son of Ahmose I, though he may have had siblings who did not live to adulthood. His reign focused on securing Egypt's borders, particularly in Nubia, where he continued his father's military campaigns. He also strengthened religious institutions, elevating the worship of Amun. Known for his contributions to architecture, he initiated building projects in Thebes. After ruling for approximately 21 years, Amenhotep I died, possibly in 1493 BC, and was deified as a protector of Theban necropolis workers, leaving a legacy of stability in devotion to Amun. His reign reinforced the role of royal women, with his mother and sisters holding significant religious and political influence, particularly in the Amun priesthood. Thutmose I's rise begins. When Amenhotep I passed away, he left no male heir to succeed him. However, the throne did not remain vacant for long. The powerful general Thutmose I, who was married into the royal family, ascended as pharaoh. His wives, Queen Ahmose and Mutnofret, secured his legitimacy, linking his reign to the royal bloodline. With Thutmose I's rise, the royal court was filled with his sons from Mutnofret. Prince Amenmose, at 24 years old, was declared heir apparent, while his younger brothers, Wajmose and Thutmose II, the next king, stood alongside him. From Queen Ahmose's line, her daughter Hatshepsut, now 18, was a royal princess of great significance, destined to leave her mark on history. Meanwhile, Moses, now 26 years old, had no official role in Thutmose I's reign. Though raised and trained in all the ways of royalty, his path had led him elsewhere. Under the watchful guidance of Anini, he was now immersed in the mysteries of the priesthood, learning wisdom beyond the halls of power. Moses' time had not yet come, but it would. Nubian revolt threatens Egypt. Word came to the Nubians that Thutmose I was gravely ill, and they saw their long-awaited chance for revenge. In 1483 BC, after a decade of preparation, they launched a two-pronged attack. One Nubian force sailed up the Red Sea, reaching the Egyptian harbor at Ain Sukna. Their army advanced 130 kilometers to Memphis, where they besieged the city. Though Memphis suffered heavy losses, the Egyptians held their ground, preventing its fall. At the same time, a second Nubian force struck Egyptian forts in Nubia, targeting strongholds built by Thutmose I. This coordinated assault caught the Egyptians off guard. With Nubians attacking from both north and south, Egypt now faced a major crisis. its forces spread thin as they fought to defend their territories. Moses leads Egypt's army. The Egyptians, suffering under great oppression, turned to their oracles for guidance. Their gods advised them to seek the help of Moses, the Hebrew. King Thutmose I, aware of the weakness of the newly crowned Pharaoh Thutmose II and his own deteriorating health, ordered his daughter, Hatshepsut, to present Moses as the leader of their army. Before doing so, Mutnofret his queen made the king swear not to harm him. She then handed Moses over, believing he would bring them victory. She also criticized the priests, who had once called for Moses' death but now relied on him. Moses agreed to lead the army, encouraged by both Mutnofret and the king. The Egyptian scribes hoped Moses' bravery would defeat their enemies, and lead to his downfall, while the Hebrews saw this as their chance for freedom. Conquering the Nubians. Moses led the Egyptian army against the Nubians. The Egyptian scribes hoped this mission would rid them of Moses, while the Hebrews saw it as a chance for deliverance. Avoiding the river route, Moses demonstrated his strategic genius by marching over land, using ibises to protect his army from the deadly serpents in the region. Surprising the Nubians, he won decisive victories, forcing them to retreat to Saba, a well-fortified city surrounded by the Nile, Astapus, and Astaboras rivers. Unable to breach the city through warfare, Moses accepted an unexpected offer, marriage to Tharbis, the Ethiopian princess, in exchange for the city's surrender. Honoring his oath, he married her, secured Egypt's victory, and returned home. Rise of Hatshepsut's power. In 1479 BC, after the death of Thutmose II, the coronation of the 2-year-old Thutmose III was a political maneuver orchestrated by the powerful figures of the Egyptian court. Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I and widow of Thutmose II, stood as the true authority, acting as regent. The priesthood of Amun, the royal bureaucracy, and military officials aligned to ensure continuity, though some factions likely opposed a mere child on the throne. The coronation ceremony at Karnak followed sacred traditions, but real governance remained in Hatshepsut's hands. The young Thutmose III, too young to understand his own kingship, became a figurehead while his stepmother strengthened her grip on Egypt. Meanwhile, Moses, now 40 years old, found himself increasingly redundant, exhausted by the endless power struggle between the rival factions. Moses rejects royal status. With the passing of his adoptive mother, Mutnofret, Moses no longer felt bound to the royal court of Karnak. Now at the age of 40 years, he chose to leave behind his privileged life and seek out his true heritage. Traveling to Avaris, he reunited with his brother Aaron and sister Miriam, who still lived among the Hebrews. Their parents had passed away, and the oppression of their people had only worsened under the new regime. Hatshepsut and her loyal officials, enraged by Moses' rejection of his royal status, saw his decision as a direct insult. His defiance was a betrayal to the palace that raised him, and they feared the consequences of his growing allegiance to the Hebrews. Moses takes action and flees Egypt. One day, as Moses walked among his people, he witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave, one of his own people. Overcome with anger, he looked around, ensuring no one was watching, and struck down the Egyptian, killing him. He buried the body in the sand, believing his act had gone unnoticed. The next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting and intervened, asking, "Why are you striking your fellow Hebrew?" But one of them replied, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Fear gripped Moses, his actions were known. News quickly spread, and the Egyptians began searching for him. Realizing his life was in danger, Moses fled Egypt, leaving behind the only home he had ever known. Moses settles in Midian. After fleeing Egypt, Moses wandered the desert until he reached Midian. Tired and thirsty, he stopped at a well, where he saw 7 daughters of Reuel drawing water. When shepherds tried to drive them away, Moses stood up for them and helped water their flock. Grateful, the women told their father, who invited Moses into his home. Moses decided to live in Midian, working as a shepherd. Though once a prince in Egypt, he now embraced a simple life, learning the ways of the desert. Yet, in quiet moments, he thought of his people's suffering. He had left Egypt behind, but he knew deep inside that his journey was not yet complete. Hatshepsut's Israel suppression. Once she became pharaoh in 1473 BC, Hatshepsut took further steps against the Israelites, possibly driven by her desire to consolidate power and eliminate any lingering traces of the Hyksos period. She confined the Israelites to Goshen and Avaris, restricting their movement and preventing them from spreading into other regions of Egypt. Continuing the harsh labor policies initiated by Ahmose I and Thutmose I, she ensured that the Israelites remained subjugated as enslaved workers, reinforcing their role in Egypt's economy. In an effort to solidify her authority, Hatshepsut also took measures to erase records of Semitic influences in Egypt, potentially explaining the lack of direct Egyptian references to figures like Joseph or Moses. Her reign thus involved not only political consolidation but also a deliberate effort to reshape Egypt's history. Israel's cry for deliverance. Under Hatshepsut's reign, the suppression of the Israelites deepened as their enslavement intensified. Despite the harsh labor conditions, they grew in number, yet their hearts remained divided. They clung to their idols and longed for the luxuries of Egypt, craving the pots of Egypt despite their suffering. Their cries for deliverance reached God, but their disobedience hindered their path to freedom. It would take many more years of hardship before they would finally cry out to God wholeheartedly, with one voice, in true repentance, recognizing Him as their only hope for liberation, at the time God had already set for their deliverance.